Police at the Borders by Abbey Volcano. From the book Queering Anarchism by C.B. Deric, J. Rogue, Deric Shannon, and Abbey Volcano. This text from theanarchistlibrary.org. Anarchism as a social movement, as an idea, as a practice, is as much about creation as it is about destruction. Mikhail Bakunin wrote, quote, "The passion for destruction is a creative passion too." End quote. Further, anarchism isn't solely centered on crushing structures like capitalism and the state, although we anarchists certainly want that. Rather, we seek to smash all institutionalized hierarchies. We reject all forms of coerced domination. But imagine if capitalism, the state, white supremacy, patriarchy, etc. were removed, if only it were that easy. What would remain? Unfortunately, not much, one could imagine. Anarchists then might also be creative. We might try to create new ways of relating to each other, new ways of relating to the non-human world, new ways of loving, knowing, playing, etc. If we don't create these new social relations, then we will likely fall back on the current ones, at worst, and will not realize our creative potential at best. Anarchists are often creating new ways of living and relating in the here and now. This chapter gives some thought on how we might do the same with sexuality while not recreating the coercive social relations that confine us now. An anarchist queer theory might also begin by attempting to tear down the borders between identities, as well as unpack their very existence and use, by showing that people are complex, as is the world, and are not easily categorized, at least not honestly. This means tearing down the normative assumptions that are used to uphold a status quo that puts some of us above others in the social order as a result of our sexual and/or gender practices. This is neatly described by the term heteronormativity, which refers to the culture of understanding and the institutionalization of heterosexual, cissexual, dyadic, monogamous, and permanent relationships as the only possible and coherent sexuality. Sometimes, too often, rather than destabilizing the hierarchically organized and institutionalized borders of heteronormativity, folks will construct new queer normative assumptions to replace our current organized, normative structures of sexuality. This is a process of inverting hierarchies instead of doing away with them. Instead of recognizing the hierarchically organized sexuality was our problem in the first place, we often flip the current normative expectations on their heads and create a twisted mirror image of the current institutionalized sexuality by hierarchically ordering a new queer sexuality. This might look like privileging non-monogamy, gender queerness, and BDSM, for example, over other types of sexuality and gender. Instead of creating a world in which sexuality is somewhat liberated, we instead create new borders and new limitations around sexuality. We have simply inverted the hierarchy and excluded those deemed not queer enough. Think of how many times you sat around with a group of well-meaning folks and the conversation has gone something like this. As a working class person, I have to say, a few nods of agreement. As a poor woman, it seems to me, even more nods. As a poor lesbian of color, I think, even more furious nodding, making sure everyone registers each other's frenetic agreement, and so on. These kinds of displays are often referred to as the oppression Olympics. People in these situations seem like they're playing a game together, a grand contest to assert who is more authentic, more oppressed, and thus more correct. It's at this point where identity becomes fetishized, where essentialist understandings of people trump good sense, and where a patronizing belief in the superiority of the wise, noble savage often overrides any sense at all. Often this tactic of agreeing with the most marginalized in the room will be used as a substitute for developing critical analyses around race, gender, sexuality, etc. This tactic is intellectually lazy, lacks political depth, and leads towards tokenization. There is a point to allowing our experiences of various forcefully assigned identities to be at the forefront of conversations. People do have different experiences based on these social constructions, and we should take these differences into account. But when they become markers of authenticity and correctness, it poses a problem for anarchists. After all, we seek to dissolve hierarchical relations, not create new ones formed from the margins. Queer theory has taken up the disconcerting task of putting identity, and by extension identity politics, under a destabilizing lens. And anarchist queer theory might give us more effective ways of relating than the oppression Olympics, as a set of games no one really wins anyway. And in an anarchist politics of sexuality and gender, this means that care needs to be taken not to invert existing hierarchies, much like the oppression Olympics do, making more authentic voices out of some over others, and creating new hierarchies to replace old ones. With this piece, then, I want to briefly talk about a few ways that I think radical queer politics and spaces have often come to invert existing hierarchies rather than doing away with them, or perhaps destabilizing them. I want to make it clear that this isn't an argument for a return to heteronormativity, nor is it an argument for an end to celebrating our queerness and the things that we desire. Rather, it is an argument that the ways we fuck, love, and gender ourselves are not inherently revolutionary, but creating a politics that refuses the hierarchical arrangement of people because of their sexual and/or gender practices, and importantly, one that does not pressure people into certain practices under the auspices of being more authentically queer, does indeed have radical implications. Aren't we all very public sluts? In the next 3 sections, I'm going to outline a few practices within some radical queer circles that I would like to critique, and that I think we can learn from. Like I noted before, this is tricky and complicated. While most queer radicals I know, or know of, are working on dismantling structures that reproduce normative assumptions about sexual identities or expected behaviors, sometimes in our struggles, we can inadvertently reinscribe these norms and then organize underneath them, unknowingly. For instance, promiscuity and public sex are for the most part frowned upon in the United States. Sexuality is to be experienced in private, monogamous relationships. Public displays of affection are okay in the United States, as long as they are heterosexual and PG-13. Throw some similarly gendered sex love in there, and bring the rating up to R, and you might get the cops called on you, or in the very least, receive a lot of scorn and tisk-tisks, and often a beating to go with it. There are examples of private nightclubs getting raided, and folks getting arrested for risky sexual activity. We have laws in the United States, they differ throughout the states, against sodomy, BDSM, and other forms of non-normative sexual activity. Folks who have desires that have been either literally outlawed and/or disapproved of culturally, not always an offense with less consequences, find themselves in a position of transgressing sexual norms when they practice their sexual desires, whether they enjoy challenging these norms or not. Challenging our own desires is an important step in trying to shed the institutionalized, directed, compulsory, organized, and controlled sexualities that have been made available to and constituted us. However, one can challenge institutionalized sexual categories and available expressions without necessarily having to swing the pendulum to the opposite side with their own sexual practices or with their own expectation for other sexual practices. For instance, just because promiscuity is a non-normative sexual desire and practice doesn't mean that to be in the act of challenging such norms that one must participate in promiscuity per se. For instance, I can reject and struggle against the sexual and gender status quo without the need to physically embody and practice certain non-normative sexualities. Sexual acts themselves, or lack thereof, are not what we are challenging as queer radicals. We are struggling against sexualities and sexual acts being categorized and ordered into hierarchical systems that privilege certain practices and desires over others. On occasion, I have seen the tendency for radical queers to assume that most, or all, radical queers have some particular non-normative sexual desire or practice. For example, assuming that radical queers are generally promiscuous, non-monogamous, enjoy making out with whomever just for the fun of it, or into BDSM or other non-vanilla sex, etc. Having witnessed this fairly often, I don't believe that folks intend to make these assumptions. What's peculiar about normative assumptions around sexuality and gender is their ability to be invisible. This is why we also need to struggle at the conceptual level. We need to not only smash the seemingly automatic jump to create and maintain status quos, but we also need to replace the notion of status quo with something else. Perhaps an awareness of the very non-necessity of status quos governing consensual sexual practices, and a very conscious understanding of the damage and limitations that these kinds of understandings can create and maintain. I am personally a rather shy and private person, and at times I have felt pressure to be promiscuous and experiment with non-normative sexual play, often by friends of mine. At times, folks will assume that of course I want to make out with my radical queer friends. Of course I want to go to the play party, and of course I wouldn't have an exclusive relationship with only one other person. These assumptions can be cleared up rather easily with an honest conversation. However, the expectation to live up to new queer norms is extremely problematic for a struggle that started off as challenging the very existence of those kinds of assumptions and limitations in the first place. These are oftentimes easy and expected mistakes to make while we struggle. It seems so ingrained in us to conceive of the correct line or correct path that it's hard to deviate from that if we're not paying very close attention and employing a great deal of self and collective reflexivity. The essentialist and egregious dynamic of the oppression Olympics actually seems to require a correct line, as it attempts to quantify, isolate, and hierarchically order different forms and experiences of multiple and overlapping oppressions. It's important to make sure that while we struggle, we do our best not to recreate what we are struggling against. Inverted hierarchies are no better than the original hierarchies, although perhaps they seem a bit more fun. It's understandable that a common reaction to expected sexual norms is to find potential value and liberation in doing the opposite. We've all reacted that way, to a degree, to systems of hierarchy at some point in our lives. But understanding this type of reaction is exactly that. A reaction is important. Instead of reacting by doing the opposite, we need ways to move forward that don't resemble our original chains, even if they are fastened backwards. A systematic vision of the way sexuality, sex, and gender are hierarchically ordered and organized and limited is more fruitful than a reaction that is typified by doing the opposite of whatever feels constraining. For those interested, Nietzsche wrote extensively on this subject, which he termed ressentiment. Not only are we still setting limits and creating new hierarchical sexual expectations when we define a liberated sexuality as one that is a direct opposite of the current socially acceptable and viable sexuality, but we are also continuing to define this liberated sexuality by that which caged us in the first place. If the opposite is liberating, then we are still being defined and limited by the original form, since its opposite is defined by itself. A large part of the radical queer project is rooted in the struggle against the creation and maintenance of the normal that is used to discipline all of us and our desires. Will the real queer please stand up? In this section, I like to develop the case for queer as a position with a context, rather than a stable or fixed identity. One thing this means is defining in queer heterosexualities, to name perhaps one controversial example. A good question to bring this point home might be, who is more oppressed, erased, and marginalized as a result of their sexuality? An upper-class white gay man living in the Castro, or a poor working-class heterosexual woman of color living in the Bible Belt who has a number of heterosexual relationships, is promiscuous, and is open about it and proud of it. Here we can imagine a heterosexual relationship perhaps being more marginalized in this context as compared to the non-heterosexual relationship that this scenario offers. This question doesn't have an answer. There are a multitude of specific contexts that would affect both of these hypothetical relationships. What this question should do, however, is make obvious that heterosexual relationships aren't always more acceptable or viable than non-heterosexual relationships. It may very well be that a non-heterosexual relationship that mirrors a normative heterosexual relationship may cause less trouble than a heterosexual relationship that involves non-normative sexual acts or manifestations of love that involve more than two people. I am not suggesting that the other overlapping positions in society don't affect these scenarios. Of course they do. In fact, the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, nation of origin, location, culture, etc. will all affect whether someone's style of loving is to be viewed as normative and acceptable or otherwise. This very fact highlights a point that the gender specificity of a relationship, straight or not, isn't always the axis of acceptance or not. We can see that there are very real ways that heterosexual relationships or styles of loving or making love can very much stand in opposition to the normal, whereas non-heterosexual relationships and ways of loving can very much mirror the normal and may not subsequently be scrutinized nor understood as abnormal. Of course, this will be heavily determined by multiple and overlapping positions, oftentimes typified by race, class, gender, and location. It makes sense then to develop queer as a relational term vis-a-vis the normal, rather than an identity marker that's just short for LGBT, or some lengthened version of the alphabet soup. I have always found it interesting to explore why some practices have historically come to constitute an identity, while others have not. As Sedgwick writes, quote, "It is a rather amazing fact that, of the very many dimensions along which the genital activity of one person can be differentiated from that of another, dimensions that include preference for certain acts, certain zones of sensations, certain physical types, a certain frequency, certain relations of age or power, a certain species, a certain number of participants, and so on, precisely one, the gender of the object choice, emerged from the turn of the century and has remained as a dimension denoted by the now ubiquitous category of sexual orientation." End quote. In queer theory, the very idea of the queer is a shifting terrain that cannot be pinned down to some single definition. Rather, queer can be understood as what is at odds with the normal or legitimate. This being the case, there is nothing in particular to which queer necessarily refers, which makes queer an identity without an essence. In this way, as demonstrated above, we can look for hierarchies within heterosexual relationships or ways of loving. A heterosexual relationship of two cisgendered and monogamous people who keep their sexuality indoors is quite different from heterosexual ways of doing relationships that involve non-monogamy, public BDSM, or selling sex for money. I did a small survey at Syracuse University in the fall of 2010, and found that the overwhelming majority of students interviewed believed it was fine that children were raised by two people of the same sex if they were in one monogamous relationship. However, at the same time, they also believe that children have no place in the home of someone who is heterosexual but has more than one relationship or is involved in a relationship that consists of more than two people. In this case, the genders within a relationship weren't a factor for judging acceptable environments for children to be raised in, but the type of relationship was a factor. Same-sex relationships are fine, as well as heterosexual relationships, but only if they are otherwise normative. Both same-sex or heterosexual relationships that were non-normative, in this case involving either more than one partner or more than one relationship, were not deemed appropriate for raising children. Obviously, with this scenario, we can see how non-gender-specific ways of loving were the problem for those interviewed, not the gender involved. Pressure to poly? I would like to focus this section on some personal experiences I've had in which queer, in part, has become synonymous with non-monogamous. I've seen people get pressure to be sexually active in queer communities in ways that we'd immediately label as coercive outside of them. Even more absurd, I've seen monogamous same-sex attracted folks defined out of queer by poly-heterosexuals for being too normal or being homonormative. Again, this understanding forces sexuality into something we are, instead of something we do, and is a retreat from a radical queer sensibility into policing the borders of identity and practice. After all, we're anarchists because we want to get rid of cops, not be them. Further, This policing of borders of identity and practice creates a troubling outside and against attitude toward the more mainstream LGBT community. Of course, not everyone in the more mainstream LGBT community are our comrades, but a lot of them could be. Although this might also depend on structural factors too, particularly the relationship to economic and/or political power. This doesn't mean we shouldn't challenge the LGBT community on concepts such as compulsory monogamy, homonormativity, racism in the movement, and uncritical fight for gay marriage, or the problematic struggles for hate crime legislation, and for the inclusion of gays in the military, and what have you. What it does mean is that we shouldn't be positioning the mainstream LGBT community as the bad guys, and turning our collective nose up to anyone who chooses to use identity labels such as lesbian. I've witnessed queer people exclaim that anyone using the identity of lesbian is oppressive. This is ridiculous, and brings us back to my earlier discussion of ressentiment. Towards a queer conclusion. Queer, by definition, is an ongoing and never-ending process, so this piece certainly isn't intended to be the last word on queer thought or practice. Also, while I'm at it, I should mention that I'm not trying to suggest that we shouldn't be public sluts, polyamorous, etc. In fact, I enjoy those things at times. And for all of us, especially those of us who spend a good deal of time in a comfortable circle of queer friends, we need to remember that the dominant society still pressures us to not be publicly queer, and to fit into a heterosexual, monogamous, and cisgender standard that is stultifying, confining, and, well, boring. As we build movements, an insular subcultural inwardness is anathema to creating broad-based mass movements, which are necessary if we're ever going to topple capitalism, the state, and other related evils. This will require ever queerer conclusions, as it is a process that likely has no definite end.